tonight we're going to be welcoming Ned Edwards, and I've known Ned for several years. He's a supporter of many nonprofits and is very active in our community. And so I'm excited to be talking about the Trapp Family Farm. It's a location we go by quite often, some of us daily, some of us hike there. But I think we forget the impact that the Trapp Farm had on our community, on employment and our culture, and getting our name out to farmers across the country and to marketplaces throughout the country. So I'm going to introduce Ned by first telling you a little bit about him. He was born in, I won't tell the year, Kansas City, Missouri, and he came to Crystal Lake for the first time in 1935. So that might give you a little hint. He's the grandson of Austin Wolfe, and he and his brother Arthur had purchased 55 acres of forest and lake frontage. The lake frontage happened to be thrown in, by the way, on the north shore of Crystal Lake in 1903. They bought it for the agriculture. During his college summers, Ned was employed at Trapp and Sons Celery Farms. He delivered produce to grocery stores from Petoskey to Charlevoix, Northport, Beulah, Manistee, and points in between. His connection with the Trapp family deepened when he married a Trapp daughter. He married Barbara, or Bobby Trapp, the love of his life, and she accompanied him to Scotland to attend theological seminary in Edinburgh. He received his Master of Divinity degree from Yale Divinity School and his Ph.D. in education from Case Western Reserve University. After retirement, so-called retirement, after the 30-year ministry in Ohio, he and Barbara retired to their home on Crystal Lake, actually family cottage. And he then went back to work. He became the founding pastor of St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, and he did retire again in 2002. But he has remained very busy since then. Actually, he's been very involved with the Cherry Hut book. He was one of the people who was really instrumental in bringing some of the stories to the Cherry Hut book, and he'll be back next month with a panel. So I'm pleased and honored to present Ned Edwards.
I want to thank Barb Mort for that very kind introduction. As you can figure quickly, I'm much too old to be doing this today. But as I was told a little while ago, that we need old people in this community. They're the ones that know the stories. And that's why I'm here. I want to thank also Larry White, who is my nephew. And because it was Larry that suggested this program, talked me into doing it, and then stood by me while I tried to put it together. And he's the one that put the whole slideshow together. He happens to live next door to me, so it was easy for us to get together and put the slideshow together. And then he just this afternoon rewrote my whole script to fit it. So yeah, I am thanking him. That's so kind of Larry. And Larry is the vice president of the Historical Society. And he is also their techie in terms of getting all this stuff together. That's because he used to own, well, he spent his whole life working for computer companies one way or another. So, as I've said to several of you tonight, I have much more material than I need, and I measure things in terms of their length by sermons. This is 3 sermons worth. That's an hour. And it's just enough. There could be a lot more. But first, I do want to introduce the Trapp family members who are here tonight, and some of those who are watching on their screens elsewhere. probably the most famous of the Trapp family that is still alive, Mary Trapp, known as Lonnie in her later years. Mary you'll see pictures of in this slideshow. She lives in Dallas and she summers on Crystal Lake in the cottage that her father built. And so we're happy to have Mary Lon. Mary Lon, would you just stand up so they know what you look like? There she is. It's Mary Lon. You'll learn in the program that she was famous along with her father and her uncle because the same year that they became famous as Onion King and president of the Michigan Celery Growers Association, she was chosen as the National Cherry Queen at the festival in 1951. And then later that same year was chosen as the homecoming queen at Michigan State University. So she's been around. Our Mary Lon's sister, Carol Claypool, is here tonight also. They are Kenneth Trapp's daughters. It's interesting that Martin Trapp, the oldest, had 4 sons. Kenneth had 3 daughters, and Howard had 3 daughters, and I had 4 sons. And it just sort of skipped generations in terms of all of our problems. But I'll introduce Barbara next. Bobby is my wife and the oldest daughter of Howard Trapp and the granddaughter of Martin Trapp. Her sister Nancy is out in Vancouver, British Columbia, watching on her laptop. So she's in on this story. And Todd Vigland is sitting in the back pew. Todd is Susie Trapp Vigland's son. And Susie was Bobby and Nancy's youngest sister, Howard's daughter. And we were very saddened just day before yesterday, Susie passed away at the Orchard House. And so Todd's here to represent his mother as a Trapp. And Todd also had many things to do, having worked for the Grand Traverse Regional Land Conservancy with the trail that went through there, helped build some of that trail through the swamp. That was a neat thing back in the 90s. Yeah. Anybody else who's a Trapp here? If not, I would like to have any people here who worked on the Trapp celery gardens or farm. Would you identify yourselves? I know David Porter is here. And when did you work there and what did you do, David? Actually, that was dangerous work. One of the things I don't mention in this program is what we called radish rash. Yeah, those. Well, a lot of the boys then went out and just pulled them up by hand without gloves until they learned better. And those radishes could really, they were worse than poison ivy. Yeah. Right. Anybody else here? I worked there, and I'll tell you about that, but I worked with David's father. His name was David also. And David Porter had worked there his whole life practically, and really was one of the people who not only knew how to manage the farm, all the different activities that went on in the farm. And in fact, it was his father that came over to the Trapps the night that my Model A Ford broke down, and it was parked in the Trapps' front yard. And I had to be at work at 4:30 the next morning, and Howard made me stay in the house. It was the first time they had a boy stay in that house with his 3 daughters. And after one night, I remember he went over to Dave Porter's and said, "Get over there and fix that car and get it out of here. Get that boy out of here." Right. That was fun. Well, with that, let's get on with the program. This is the title slide. Okay, Larry. There we go. This is the logo of Trapp & Sons. This happens to be a needlepoint that my wife made for Howard just before he died, actually. And it hung in his house for many, many, many years. But this is what you saw on the trucks, the big yellow insulated trucks that rolled through Beulah every single day on their way to deliver the celery and radishes and cabbage and lettuce and onions and potatoes and whatever else was on the menu that day. And the clue to the story about the Trapps is the little Dutch girls that are holding up the Beulah Products sign. And those little Dutch girls in the logo, they told the story of the muck farming. And if you Google muck farming, you'll find an article by a professor at Calvin College in Grand Rapids about Dutch immigrants. Dutch immigrants who were experts at draining swamps to produce rich soil. And that rich soil contained huge amounts of nitrogen for growing green vegetables, tulip bulbs, and if not tulip bulbs, why not onions? The author of that article's name is William Caterberg, and he says, and I quote, "The Netherlands is famous for much of it being below sea level and for reclaiming land from marshes and the sea. And governments sometimes recruited Dutch immigrants to drain marshes or to farm the rich black soil. The Dutch were also famous for bulb flowers like tulips, so onions were an obvious choice for farming." End quote. And that's what Trapp & Sons finally became, an onion farm. But we'll get to that later. Martin Trapp was a Dutch immigrant. He knew about muck farming. He was born in 1876 on the island of Texel. See up there, that little island up there? That's where Martin was born. Texel, an X in the Dutch language is a double S in our language, so it's Texel. And at the age of 5 in 1881, his father, whose also name was Martin, he was a grocer, but he decided to leave their family home on that island just north of Amsterdam, and with 5 children, he sailed for America to set up a grocery store in Grand Rapids and then in Muskegon, where many Dutch immigrants were living and farming and creating a close community with each other. That's how Holland, Michigan got its name and reputation, and Zeeland, Michigan. There's a picture of Martin Trapp on his 21st birthday. This picture was taken, as you could see, in Muskegon, Michigan. And it would have been 1897. The next picture is a picture of Martin and his new wife. They were married in Zeeland, Michigan in 1899. The first record of the Trapps in Benzie County was Martin's teaching at the Homestead School in 1907. And that's Martin right there. You can see how young he is still. Teaching at the Homestead School. I think that building is still out there on Homestead and Pioneer Road, isn't it? Somewhere around there. The census of 1910 has Martin and his oldest son, Art, living at the school, and his wife, Mary, living with the other sons in Benzonia. And those sons were Kenneth and Howard, the two that finally joined their father in partnership with the farm. Donald was the youngest son and the first to be born in Benzie County. Martin was also a mailman. And this is the gathering of all rural mail carriers in 1917 down in Bear Lake. And a picture was taken, and you can see Martin up there in the top with the hat on. He's the one at the top of the list. And he worked as a mail carrier at the same time he was running the farm up until 1941, 25 years of mail carrying, which put him in touch with all the farmers in the area. And so he knew who to go to when he needed help with something. He knew everybody. That's what mail people do. Here we see what Beulah looked like in 1909. 1909, as you can see, it was a rather small town. This would have been one of Martin's first times looking at a town like this. And one of the things I want you to notice is this soil down here. That's muck. In fact, everything was muck. And you'll see the land back here, all the way as far as you can see, and all this land was to become Trapp and Sons Celery Farm. Here is a map from 1901. 1901, 121 years ago. This was the map of, as it says, Beulah Resort. I have the actual copy of the actual map that was done by the surveyor. The county surveyor at that time was a Mr. Pettit. And Mr. Pettit drew the map, and the name he puts on it is the Beulah View Resort. And that name refers to the book Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, which was the most read and famous book at the turn of the century. The reason that it was called Beulah View Resort is because when Pilgrim gets to Beulah in the book, he sees a view of heaven. So the Beulah View Resort was the place that was closest to heaven. And that's what it was called. And then it just became an addition to Beulah. That's the yellow part down there. The next map is a map of Beulah from 1915. And you can see that all the land from the railroad came through here. All this land, all the way as far as you can see, was the Trapp farm. All of that property. There was one row of houses There still is just one row of houses in front of the Trapp farm. This photo of the Trapp family was taken in 1933. Ken and Howard are the two sons standing right behind their father, Martin. That's Kenneth and that's Howard. And that's Martin and his wife, Mary Van Cleve. And Ken was also married to a Mary. That's Ken's wife. And they had a grandchild for the Martin Trapps. Who's this little girl here, and her name is Mary Lon. And I think this was when you were 2 years old and 32, so that'd be 33. You're about a year old. Yeah. And the reason I chose this picture is because of an article that I found in the Escanaba Daily Press, of all places, to find an article about Martin Trapp and the Trapp farm. And you can see the headline there. Oh, by the way, the date on this was, on this newspaper, it was August 23rd, 1933. That was right in the depths of the Depression. And the article is from an interview that this reporter had probably by visiting Beulah and talking to Martin. And I'm going to, in this presentation, be referring to this article all the way through because it is such an amazing summary of the philosophy and way in which that farm was operated. The headline there, as you could see, was "Celery growing becomes big industry in Beulah." And this is the way the article begins. 100 miles across Lake Michigan, you all know where Escanaba is. It's in the UP, just as you get into the UP above Wisconsin, it's across the lake. 100 miles across Lake Michigan, Beulah's harvest of white gold, I want you to remember that term, white gold, is on its way to market. The outskirts of this little town, as far as the eye can see, are covered with acres of celery, delicate green at the top, in vivid contrast to the rich brown of the swamp land. There's the rich brown and the celery. This is just one field, and they had about 6 or 8 fields of that. But I want to talk about the black muck first. The story of that land is the story of how that family created these fields. And you can see that from the viaduct, which is right here on US 31, that the Trapp barns were here. That's where the where all the equipment was kept. And these were their fields just ready for planting in the spring. There's 2 of them, there's another 3, there's another 3 there, another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 over there. That was about 76 acres. And you can also see in this picture, the Trapp barn was right there, and there's the cooler right on Main Street in Beulah. And the farm actually began right here. That was part of the farm. That's where it started. And the in the 1930s, the government decided to build a bypass of US 31 around Beulah, so people didn't have to go downtown and buy anything. And So what they did is they cut the farm right down the middle. They came down on the viaduct here from Benzonia and cut the farm. And from here, the bottom of the viaduct, back all the way down to almost Crystal Drive, they were plowing up muck to build that highway. Stacy Daniels. Is Stacy here tonight? He said he might be. But he was very kind to call me and give me the many references in his book, The Comedy of Crystal Lake, to the Trapp farmland. I didn't realize he had so much in there about the Trapp farmland. Along with he sent me a current analysis of the soil by Dr. Paul Rutledge, who had volunteered to do this and to suggest further action to be taken to bring that land back into its natural state, and was doing this for the Land Conservancy. Before the lowering of Crystal Lake in 1873, and you know that story, that was the story about Archibald Jones trying to build a canal from the outlet at Crystal Lake. And that September 9th, the storm came up and washed out the coffer dam, began Crystal Lake flowing into Lake Michigan. And according to Stacy, it went down 18 feet in some places. And what it did was, of course, drain the Trapp farmland, which had been 4 to 6 feet underwater before Crystal Lake was lowered. It was, the Trapp farmland was originally this swamp, cedar swamp, whose vegetation had been growing and falling into the swamp for thousands of years. So all of that all that good organic material was down there under the water. And the lowering of Crystal Lake did the job of draining the swamp. We didn't need any dikes like they did in Holland. The drying and compacting of the swamp bed produced muck. Muck is a fine, powdery substance when dry, but teeming with nutrients, including high quantities of natural nitrogen from the decomposition of the organic materials. And when it became wet, it was highly productive soil. And that's the kind of soil that could produce a whole generation of celery in less than 2 months. So it was ready to go to market by the end of June and wasn't planted until early on in May. There were 4 branches of what we now call a cold creek that flowed down through and around this muck, joining into a single stream to enter Crystal Lake. So that river provided the water for irrigation and for making the muck productive. And in 2012, measurements made by Dr. Rutledge and his analysis show the muck still had a 45% nitrogen content, which is huge. Fertilizer was not needed. Notice again how the highway cuts right through that farm. And here's the story that Stacy tells in his book. When resorters bathed in Crystal Lake in Beulah in the early years of Muck Farm, Trapp and Sons was blamed for muck covering the bathers when they came out of the lake. Martin did everything he could to prevent that, enlarging the settling basin. This is where the settling basin flows on in under the road in Beulah. And you can see here remnants of the weirs and filters that he tried to put in there to keep the muck from going in. Quoting Stacy Daniels' book, The Comedy of Crystal Lake, quote, "The resorters commented that the water was not fit to bathe in. And when one goes into the water, he's compelled to wash off the dirt on his legs when he comes out. But then it was also pointed out that much of the silt and refuse now being dumped into Crystal Lake through the mouth of Cold Creek did not come from the drainage of the Trapp farm, but was instead an accumulation of sediment from the recent building of the road grade of US 31 through the muck land, which was formerly a portion of the celery beds." So do you ever wonder why that section of the highway is always being repaired? Why it's always sinking and cracking and they're always pouring new slabs across that? Well, the highway is built on soft, spongy muck, and tons of muck were plowed up during the construction of the highway, some of it ending up in Crystal Lake. And that muck, had been there under 50 years of accumulated topsoil after Archibald Jones had caused the lowering of Crystal Lake, for the immigrant Dutchman, Martin Trapp, to discover in 1923 when he planted for the first time a small stand of celery to see what would happen. Well, the ironic thing was that Martin Trapp bought Archibald Jones's old stables in Benzonia. And those stables, he bought them around 1940 and used them for storage barns. But then he tore them down in the early 50s and built a house. And this is on the corner of Barber and River Road, right kitty corner from the museum. And he probably built that house never knowing that the first owner was directly responsible for draining his muck farm and enabling the expansive celery and onion industry in Beulah. I have particular affection for that house because it, being Martin's house, turned out to be the location where I dressed along with my groomsmen for my wedding in 1956. And right kitty-cornered from the town church, now the museum, it was easy to get your tux on there and run across the street and get into the church. But let's get back to the Escanaba Daily Press article from 89 years ago. It goes on reading, "Until a few years ago, Beulah was known only as a resort town on the shores of Crystal Lake, and its backyard displayed the carelessness and lack of enterprise for which small towns are noted. Then came a man with foresight and a dream of achievement, Martin Trapp. Then employed as a rural mail carrier, he found time in his odd moments of 1923 to plant a stand of celery on a plot of poor old pasture land. In the 10 years since that humbling beginning, Mr. Trapp has expanded his production to a total of 30 freight car loads per season and placed Beulah in prominence as the largest celery town north of Muskegon." Here's an aerial photograph of Beulah, probably in the 1980s. It shows the two Trapp barns, Quonset huts, down below the viaduct, which were right next to Case Road. And from that point up to Eldridge Road was all Trapp Farm. You can see also in this picture you can see the settling basin. that is still there. And I think that would be the Trapp barn. Those are the barns today. You drive down over the viaduct, you look down and you see those. They're been used for many different things, but this barn in the front here was the one in which I always had to keep my truck. I had to be there at 4:30 in the morning every day, which was really hard after Barbara and I had go to the drive-in theater, get up and get there by 4:30 in the morning, and then return my truck there in the evening. The second barn, which has been totally redone down here, that was used for drying onions and onion seed. There was huge electric fans in there, and they'd pile all that onion seed in there and turn on the fans. Back to the 1933 article from Escanaba. Quote, the crisp white stems from 50 acres are bleached and brought in prime condition by an intricate system of progressive planting. Now, why white celery and not green? Well, white celery is called and was called then Paschal celery, and the grocers all knew that. They'd say, I want 4 cases of Paschal celery. Paschal is from the Latin word for Easter. It's Easter celery because it's white, and it was very tender and very delicious. Nothing like it today. But Paschal celery, Easter celery, was particularly crisp and flavorful through a process of bleaching while growing in the fields. About 2 weeks before it was being cut, they would take this opaque paper and wrap around a whole row from one to the other, holding them up with metal rods they stuck in the ground. And it would sit that way for a week or two until they decided it was bleached enough and white enough to cut. And by the way, here in this picture is the Trapp barn, the original Trapp barn that is still there today beside what we call the Bravo Cafe. It's the original Martin Trapp barn, and these fields were planted right behind that barn, right in Beulah, and probably the highway came later right through that field. So the celery became known as white gold. Don Barnard has written this book called Growing Up Stories. He wrote it back in the 90s. And I happened to be eating a piece of cherry pie when I was reading it, and that's why it's got those marks on it. But one of the chapters in there is called Working for the Trapps. And it's a wonderful chapter, and it gives details of the process of planting this celery. And I'm just going to summarize. I wish I had time to read the way he explains it. But this is that packing process where they're taking the cut celery and bundling it and getting it ready to put into crates. And this went on every day that I worked there, starting early in the morning, so that there were plenty of crates of celery to distribute all over, not only the east coast of Michigan, but the west coast of, or it's the other way around. west coast of Michigan, the east coast of Wisconsin. So the article says the planting process enables the packing plant to operate at volume production from June through October. And here is how the process worked. These greenhouses were right behind the two barns we saw. And in late February, early March, seeds were planted in those celery seeds, and they grew and became small plants by late April, early May. The planting process, Don describes as there were two on each team of planters. One was the dropper and one was the planter. The one on his knees down there with rubberized knees so he didn't drown, he was the planter. The one standing beside him was the dropper. And the dropper, every 6 inches, would drop a plant. And you saw that block back there. The block with the fence-like thing on it was where they put it in the soil, and it would mark where he would take 2 fingers and press them into the muck, and then take the plant that the dropper dropped and put it right in there. And they could do probably 3 or 4 acres a day. It was all hand work. After the planting was done, the irrigation pumps began, and irrigation ditches were built around each field. And the irrigation was done daily, keeping the plants watered and growing. Here we have a picture we've seen before, but this shows how they laid out the bleaching paper on each side of each row, and then they'd come along and lift it up and stake it on one side, stake it on the other. You can see how large that field is. But they could get all that bleaching paper on that entire field in probably 3/4 of a day. Then this is a picture again of the bleaching celery as it stood in the field behind the barn. And the barn today, you see, looks just like that. Got a Ukrainian flag out in front of it. But that's the barn today, and that barn went up in the 1920s, 100 years old. The harvesting of the celery, men are cutting it over here with big butcher knives and loading it on the truck to take back to the washing stations. And I think here's one of the earliest washing stations. Look at those vehicles. Aren't those something else? That's from the probably from the later part of the 20s. And there's the photo of the celery being washed and sorted. There were women there in a row and men too, who were taking the stalks and making sure they were all clean and ready to be packed. And then it was crated and brought for storage. Here's a view of the inside of the cold storage building, we called it, which is now the Bravo Cafe. Where it says Bravo Cafe, it used to say Trapp and Sons. And where the sign is 107, that was one of the offices. It was built. So there were 2 offices on each side of the loading section there. One was Howard's. Howard was the businessman. He did all the marketing and set out the bills and collected the money and went to the bank. And Kenneth was the field man. He was out there in the fields every day, instructing the workers and keeping them moving. And he had his office on this end. Also in this end, since he was always out in the field, was all the machinery for the cooling process. And the cooler was built probably in the late 30s, but used right up to the end. The Escanaba article continues that 3 trucks are maintained to supply the Michigan market from Petoskey and the Grand Traverse region south to Manistee. This photo shows Kenneth Trapp with one of the trucks from the early 1930s. That was before the logo was painted in its current form on there. Now, my employment as a driver of one or more of these trucks began in a series of very strange events, which I'll outline quickly, and I think it's significant. It says something about these Trapps. The strange event started with my asking Howard Trapp if I could take his daughter Barbara out on a date on Labor Day weekend in 1952. That was exactly 70 years ago this summer. It was just before I was to leave for college in Massachusetts. On that date, we climbed Sleeping Bear and were mesmerized not only by each other, but by the display of northern lights that we saw from the top of the bear. And losing track of time, we suddenly realized it was 2 o'clock in the morning. And when I got Barbara home, Father Howard was at the door in his pajamas, grabbing her into the house and slamming the door in my face. That was my first meeting of Howard. The next time I saw Howard was the following June in New York City in Grand Central Station. It so happened that I had gone to Princeton, New Jersey for a summer job working at a hardware store. And I had received a letter from Barbara saying they were coming to New York for a holiday, and could I meet them under the clock in Grand Central Station 2 o'clock in the afternoon on June 22nd. And there we met. And I had no sooner shaken Howard's hand than he said, "Would you please join me in the men's room?" And I thought I was in for a little trouble, because he probably remembered what had happened the previous September. But Howard surprised me. When we got in the men's room, he said, "Ned, would you like a job on my farm this summer? And can you be there by the 1st of July?" That gave me something like 8 or 9 days to pack up my stuff, take a train to Kansas City, get all the rest of my stuff, and then have Howard meet me in Thompsonville when I got off the train with my bicycle. And there I was. I arrived in Beulah on June 30th, and the rest is history. 3 summers driving for Trapp and Sons, 53, 54, 55, and then marrying Barbara. I was soon learning to drive this 2.5-ton insulated truck with 5 on the floor. My truck teachers were Bill Carmine and Shelton Case, who were the men who had driven those things for years. And they took me around to every grocery store, restaurant, camp, kitchen from Petoskey and Charlevoix, south to Elk Rapids, Traverse City, Northport, Honor, Beulah, Frankfort, Arcadia, Onekama, and Manistee. Do you remember how many grocery stores there were in Beulah in 1953? There were 5? I thought there were 3. I thought there was Brandt's IGA store, the A&P. Everybody had an A&P in those days, and it was a big store. And it was right down the street from your hardware store, wasn't it? Yeah, right there. And then there was Ely's. And we went to Ely's for meat, even though it was better in honor. Or that was the, yeah, cross. That. So there we were. And everybody wanted the celery. Now, up in Benzonia, of course, there were Maddox grocery store. Now, delivering to all these stores was a fascinating experience. I could go on and on about these characters who owned these stores. So many of them had gotten into the grocery business during the Depression because that said that was the sure way of having food on the table, to own a grocery store. And you could buy it all wholesale. So that was a big deal. But on one delivery run to the store in Manistee, stores in Manistee, I stopped at a newly set up farm market. It was in a parking lot. And the owner had sort of waved my truck in. It was just as I came in to cross the bridge into Manistee. And the owner said, well, open your truck. Let's see what you got. So I opened the truck and he looked in and said, I'll buy the whole load. And handed me two $100 bills. And I explained I had other customers to serve, could only sell him a limited amount. But he said, I want the whole load, and handed me another $100 bill. So I now had $300 bills worth about $1,500 in today's money. And I said, just a minute, I better call my boss. So there was a phone booth right on the corner. It cost me 15 cents to call Beulah, and I talked to Howard, who explained that what had happened here was that this huckster was trying to corner the market on the produce, so everyone would have to come to him to buy fresh celery, radish, cabbage, and lettuce. And Howard was a shrewd man, and he said, let's fix it. Keep the money, unload your whole truck. I'll have another truck fully loaded and arrive there in less than an hour. Take your time and wait for me right there. So I took a long time unloading that truck. And when Howard arrived with a fully loaded truck, the huckster was sort of dumbfounded. He watched as I gave Howard the $300 bills. And then Howard said to him, thank you very much for your order, but we won't be delivering here anymore. So I had two loads to unload that day in Manistee, and it was a very, very good day. Back to Escanaba, the article said a large part of the celery grown in Beulah is picked, washed, bunched, and crated each morning for shipment by car ferry to Manitowoc and on to Green Bay, Milwaukee, and Escanaba, where it appears on grocery shelves the very next morning. That's a lot of celery. We figured there were two freight car loads that went every morning across the lake. This is a very early picture. I think it's on the wall in the museum, showing the initial routes of the Ann Arbor car ferry. And the one that says to Gladstone there, you'll see that was the name of a small town where there was a dock, but Escanaba is right below that. So you had Manitowoc, Kewanee, Menominee, Escanaba, Gladstone, and Manistee, where the ferries went to. And the celery was taken to Manitowoc. One carload then was shipped down to Milwaukee after they'd unloaded what they needed in Manitowoc. The other carload went north to Green Bay and on up to Escanaba. That was quite an operation. And I remember in 1953 and 54 loading a freight car over in Frankfort, seeing to it that it got on the car ferry. Now, other products there, as you see on the ticket that we used, and you notice this was in the 1940s. The date said 194, and then you filled in the thing. And actually, we used those still through the 50s and 60s because they had so many of them. But you see, you checked off the cases of celery and the cases of cauliflower, cabbage, lettuce, onions, and peppers. We didn't have peppers when I was there, but we did have potatoes. The radishes were very popular. They were the best radishes I've ever seen in my life and tasted. And one of the bakery truck drivers that followed me from store to store always wanted to trade me a box of donuts for 2 bunches of radishes. One he'd eat, and he said the other one was for his wife. And cabbage sold then for 3 cents a pound, and didn't last very long. It's delicious cabbage. And one of the genius things about the Trapps was their ability to invent what was needed to do the job. And this particular article, Swampland Payoff, features this particular machine that the Trapps invented and built and made to work. It's made up of 4 hammocks on 4 wheels to span 4 rows of lettuce. Lettuce was planted by seed, and there was always too much, and it had to be thinned. This was a lettuce thinning machine, and they made it so that the boys could lie down in the 4 hammocks and have their hands free to reach down and thin the lettuce. And the one in the hammock between the outside and the left rear wheel, right there, this guy's feet controlled the speed of the engine and steered the thing. So he steered and drove it with his feet while they would, 4 rows at a time, thin out the lettuce, which was a very quick job then. The Escanaba Press article continues, the success of Martin Trapp and Sons is by no means an accident. Mr. Trapp is an opportunist of the finest sense. Back in 1918, he was appointed director of the Benzie County Farm Bureau, and in that position had the occasion to interview Henry Ford. Henry Ford used to like to come up to Frankfort, and he'd stay at what's now the Frankfort Hotel. And the story goes that when he would check out, he'd give them he could stay, I think, for 4 nights for $5.15 or something like that. And he'd present them with a $20 bill, and they didn't have change. That was too much money. So they had to send him down to the bank to get the money to pay for his room at the Frankfort Hotel. But anyway, Henry Ford came over and met with Martin Trapp, and they talked about matters of mutual interest. And it was on that occasion that Mr. Ford, with suggestions from Mr. Trapp, first proposed a plan for the cooperation of industry and agriculture. From that conversation came a vision for the Ford project of suburban homes and home gardens for employees. But that was not all. Mr. Trapp, deeply impressed with the fundamental soundness of the cooperative principles expressed by Mr. Ford, determined to put them to practice at the first opportunity. He saw that farmers on his mail route were forced by the very nature of their work to be virtually unemployed for several months of the year. And he saw, moreover, that an industry of seasonal nature could utilize this period of slack employment at the same time bring experience to help with the requirements of the Trapp farm. there must be cooperation. The cooperation there was. At present, this was in 1933, 25 to 30 men and boys, most of them farmers, do their morning and evening chores at home, but to spend their days in the fields and buildings of the Trapp and Sons and earn a substantial part of their income in this way. And this, of course, was in the dark days of the Depression, and people needed money. There's so many out of work, and farming products at an all-time low and with their prices. But Martin Trapp's work philosophy proved not only popular with his employees, but a winner for the whole community. The conclusion of the Escanaba article is about this very thing. Quote, Mr. Trapp is modest about his accomplishments. Much deserved credit he gives to his sons, Howard and Kenneth, who are partners in the business. When asked about cooperation with the NRA, what does that bring to mind to you? Cooperation with the NRA, well, I looked it up, and it's the National Recovery Act. The National Recovery Act was passed by Congress in 1933, that very year, and was intended to force employers to pay fair wages. It specified specific percentage of profits that should go to wages. And it was one of the things that helped the country out of the Depression. But anyway, it wasn't the National Rifle Association. So Martin explained that agriculture, of course, is exempt for the National Recovery Act. But he said, we are doing everything in our power to observe the spirit of national recovery. On the very first of this month, we raised all wages 10%, and hope to continue to make further raises as our profits advance. Our business code is the golden rule, and that we have tried to observe from the very beginning. We treat our employees as we would like to be treated. And Don Barnard's chapter on his growing up book about working for the Trapps emphasizes this philosophy. He tells of the kindness of Kenneth Trapp, bringing them donuts and sometimes cherry pie out to the field to give the boys a break in their hard and dirty work of planting celery. Don says, and I quote, the Trapps were considerate, wonderful people to work for. And I couldn't agree more. An example, early on my job as a truck driver, I thought it'd be fun to see how fast a fully loaded truck could coast down the big hill on US 31 as you come down to the junction with M22 on your final run into Manistee. So I put down the clutch at the top of the hill, and I was up to 75 miles an hour before I heard the siren of the state trooper. The details of my coasting experiment did not impress the trooper, and I was told to immediately appear in Manistee court before the judge. I had no money other than the change I carried to deal with customers. The fine was $25 at about 3 days' wages at $1 an hour. When I returned to Beulah, I told Howard Trapp of the incident and that I had used the Trapp and Sons money to pay the fine. He looked at me quietly for a few moments, and then with a serious and kind of smile on his face, he said, this time we'll cover it, but any more traffic fines are on you. I was greatly relieved. That's how nice a guy he was. As a treat for Barbara's 18th birthday in August, Howard suggested that I take her along on my most scenic route, the trip to Northport and back. It was a wonderful trip. We went up by way of M22 and back through the center of Leelanau Peninsula. And there Kenneth Trapp was waiting for us because we were a little late. But treating your employees as you would like to be treated was a win-win philosophy for owner employees. And the Trapps were very community-minded with their not only giving, but activities. Both Kenneth and Howard and Martin, I should say, were very active in the Benzonia Congregational Church. And Ken served on the Beulah Village Council. Howard was president of Benzonia. Both Howard and Ken and Martin were members of the Beulah and Benzonia Chamber of Commerce. Howard was very active in the Kiwanis Club, became governor of the state in Kiwanis. He was very active in the Boy Scouts, even though he had 3 daughters. And he received Scouting's highest award, the Silver Beaver Award. And Martin spent hours each spring in the 1940s and 50s planting tulip bulbs and gladiolas all along Highway 31 from about the entrance of the road from Beulah onto 31 down past, well, almost to Crystal Drive. It was amazing how many flowers he planted. And there were articles in the newspaper back in the 1950s, which told about how that had brought so many tourists from different parts to see that huge flower garden and to see it so beautiful. Well, in the 1940s, Martin Trapp met Clarence Downing. And there Martin Trapp is with the Clarence Downing and his wife. Downing was the breeder of the Downing Yellow Globe onion, which was one of the most popular onions in the all United States. Very juicy, very sweet. And they became friends, and Martin agreed to grow and feature yellow globe onions on the muck farm. Here we see onions in bloom. July 1966. Here we see onions being harvested. Crates of onions sitting there in the fields. Here we see onions drying in the fields. Tons and tons of onions. But you know, Ken Trapp thought he could do one better. And one day he called up Clarence Downing and said, let's get together and make a better onion. And he took the yellow globe and a variety of onion called Vermontville, wherever that came from, Vermont maybe, that grew very well in the muck, took them down to Michigan State Agricultural College, and within a year or two had a new hybrid variety of onion known as the Beulah Yellow Globe onion. And here they are, a field produced a king. That's Howard on the left, Ken on the right, with a crate of onions. And that was the year newspaper article came out in October of 53, but it was 2 years after the muck farm began to focus on onions as a product. And Kenneth was named by the Onion Growers Association the Onion King of 1951. Here is Ken on the right, holding a bag saying Beulah onions. That was the Beulah Yellow Globe onion. And he is, Ken was a good salesman, a good speaker. He was one that was showing off the onion in those pictures. In the year 1951 was a crowning year for the Trapp family. Not only was Ken named Onion King, but Howard became president of the Michigan Celery Growers Association based in Kalamazoo and suggested that they send a crate of celery to the Queen of Holland as a commemoration of their Dutch heritage and what they had done and learned and gained in the United States. And they did just that under Howard's leadership. And that was the same year that Mary Lawn became chosen as the National Cherry Queen at the Traverse City Cherry Festival. And later that fall, as I said, she was coming homecoming queen at Michigan State. Yeah, in that picture, we saw the three celebrities in a well-published photo. This picture is a photo of Martin Trapp and his wife Mary at the Cherry Hut. Let's go back there. At the Cherry Hut in 1951. That was the year that the Cherry Hut built the jam counter outdoors. And Mary Lawn was not only chosen as Cherry Queen, she was also in her fourth year as manager of the Cherry Hut this was under the Petrits, yes, in that year. Petrits owned the Cherry Hut from 1950 until 1959 when it was sold to Harold Leonard Case. Now here's an interesting picture. I just snuck this one in. I think it's good because it shows the entire Trapp family with children and grandchildren celebrating the 50th wedding anniversary of Martin and Mary in Ken Trapp's backyard in Beulah. This was taken in 1949. And people who are here tonight and people you might know, Mary Lawn, Carol Claypool, Barbara's sister Nancy, that's Howard, that's Ken, and this is Susie Vigeland sitting down on the ground by her grandmother. A neat picture. It was the only picture we have of the whole Trapp brood all at once. Well, by the 1970s, time was running out for Trapp and Sons. Martin had died in 1962, and though Ken and Howard kept the business very much alive, the outlawing of some pesticides, loss of muck from wind and irrigation, made competition with downstate farmers and with cheap labor in Western states very difficult. It was very hard to make a profit when working against those things. So this showed the decision in 1981 by Ken and Howard to close down all operations except seed growing. And that went on for another year. Interestingly, this field of onions in this picture planted by Trapp and Sons at Grace and Ballard Roads in Gilmore Township. They had property all over the place. They grew onions. This was, over by Alberta. They had many onion fields along Platte Lake and around Platte Road. And it says here that they were producing Trapp's hybrid number 8 onion seed. So it was just a year later in 1982 that Ken passed away. And his death was not expected that soon. But and then it was just a year and a half later that his brother Howard died in 1984. And I remember visiting Howard the Christmas of 1983 when he was bedridden, but he was still on the phone every day following up on onion seed customers who hadn't paid their bills. And I remember listening to him talk on the phone. He would say, "I'm not going to live very long and my wife will need the money. Please get it to me right away." And he reported to me a week or two later that all the money had come in. But it was 7 years later in 1991 that Howard's wife, Muriel, donated 76 acres of the Trapp Celery Farm property to the Grand Traverse Regional Land Conservancy for it to be restored to its natural state of swamp and tree lands, which is what you see now from the viaduct to the east and up 31 to Eldridge Road, that property turning back into swamp. That property just growing trees and allowing itself, they've now filled in all the irrigation ditches, and they have done everything they can to give it, to get the branches of the Cold Creek to go where they used to go. But it was Dr. Rutledge who did the study in 2012 to help with the problem of flooded basements that was happening with the buildings along US 31 there, because of the water table had not only come up a little bit on Crystal Lake by that time, but also there was not sufficient drainage velocity, I guess you'd say, to take the water off fields. Remember, they out behind the Honeymoon Hotel, they had that big golf range, and more than not, it was underwater, and people were hitting their golf balls, or they'd all float in or something. I read that, something about that. But the process of making that land back into a swamp, into what it would naturally be ecologically correct, was a long-term process. It's still going on and will continue to this day. Here's a picture of the settling basin dug 70 years before, still filtering muck as Cold Creek flows into Crystal Lake, and next to it, the Trapp Park, which was the last of the land, Trapp farmland that Muriel donated to the village of Beulah in 2005. So the legacy of the man who made poor pasture land into the most successful produce farm in northwestern Michigan became a new kind of gift to us all. Glenn Chown and Charlie Kerr and Todd Vigeland, other members of the Conservancy, built a beautiful trail through that farmland. And as the land returns to its former natural state, I'm sure it still will be enjoyed as an ecological blessing to Beulah and our county. These men were great men. They were real giants of their day. Thank you.